For 12 years, Margaret Collins had asked herself the same question. Why did her daughter stop loving her? There had been no huge argument. No dramatic goodbye. No final conversation where Emma told her mother she never wanted to see her again. It simply happened after Emma's wedding. Before the wedding, Emma called Margaret almost every day. She would ask what dress she should wear, complain about the wedding flowers, talk about the food, and sometimes call her mother just to say goodnight. Margaret had been more than a mother to her. She had been Emma's best friend. But 3 weeks after the wedding, everything changed. Emma stopped answering her calls. Then her messages became shorter. Eventually, there were no replies at all. Margaret tried to understand. She told herself that Emma was busy adjusting to married life. Then one evening, Emma finally called. Her voice sounded cold. "Mom, I need some space." Margaret's heart sank. "Did I do something?" "No." "Then what's wrong?" There was a long silence. Finally, Emma said, "I just don't want to talk about it." And that was the last real conversation they ever had. For the next 12 years, Margaret watched her daughter's life from a distance. She heard through relatives that Emma had moved to another state. She heard that she had a son. Then she heard that Emma had bought a house. But Margaret wasn't invited into any of it. She never held her grandson. She never received a birthday call. She never knew what Emma's favorite restaurant was anymore. Every year, Margaret sent one birthday card. Emma never responded. Still, Margaret never stopped sending them. Then, one rainy afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Margaret was cleaning out the storage room when she found an old wooden box. It belonged to Emma. Margaret had packed it away after the wedding because Emma had told her she didn't want to take everything to her new home. Inside were old photographs, school certificates, childhood drawings, and several letters. Margaret smiled as she looked through them. Then she found a small envelope hidden beneath a stack of photographs. There was no stamp, no address. Only one sentence written across the front. "Mom, please read this when you're alone." Margaret immediately recognized Emma's handwriting. Her hands began to tremble. She opened it. Inside was a letter dated 3 days after Emma's wedding. Margaret started reading. "Mom, I don't know how to explain what I'm about to do. Please don't think I stopped loving you. I didn't. I'm leaving because I was told something about you that I don't know how to believe." Margaret stopped. Her eyes moved back to the sentence. "Something about you." She continued. "They told me you had been hiding something from our family for years. I wanted to ask you. I really did. But then I was shown proof." Margaret's heart began pounding. "What proof?" The letter continued. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't stay close to you anymore. If what they showed me is true, I don't know who you are anymore." The letter ended there. There was no signature. No explanation. No name of the person who had shown Emma the supposed proof. Margaret sat on the floor for several minutes. 12 years. 12 years believing her daughter had simply chosen another life. But Emma hadn't left because she stopped loving her. She had left because someone had convinced her that her own mother was hiding something terrible. Margaret immediately searched the box again. At the very bottom, she found an old photograph from Emma's wedding. Margaret had seen it hundreds of times. Emma was smiling beside her husband, Daniel. But this time Margaret noticed something she had never seen before. In the background stood a woman. She wasn't part of the wedding party. She wasn't a relative. And she was looking directly at Emma. Margaret turned the photograph over. There was a date. And underneath it, for handwritten words. "She knows the truth now." Margaret felt a chill. Who was the woman? What had Emma been shown? And why had someone wanted her daughter to believe that her own mother couldn't be trusted? For the first time in 12 years, Margaret realized something painful. She hadn't lost her daughter. Someone had taken her away from her. Margaret kept staring at the old wedding photograph. She had looked at that picture countless times over the years, but somehow she had never noticed the woman standing in the background. She placed the photograph on the kitchen table and looked at it again. The woman appeared to be in her late 40s. She was standing near the entrance of the wedding hall, slightly away from the guests. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was simply watching Emma. Margaret wondered if she had been there that day for a reason. She searched through the other photographs from Emma's wedding. In one picture, the woman was near the staircase. In another, she was standing beside a group of guests. In every photograph, she seemed to be somewhere nearby. Then Margaret noticed something strange. The woman was wearing the same silver necklace in every photograph. Margaret suddenly remembered seeing that necklace before. She had seen it at Emma's engagement party, but she couldn't remember who had been wearing it. Margaret opened an old drawer where she kept photographs and cards from Emma's childhood. After searching for several minutes, she found a picture taken at Emma's graduation. There was the same necklace. The woman was standing beside Emma. Margaret's hands began to shake. She turned the photograph over. There was a message written on the back. "Thank you for trusting me." Margaret had no memory of writing it. She immediately called her sister, Linda. Linda had been close to Emma before the wedding. If anyone knew who the woman was, it would be her. "Linda, do you remember a woman who came to Emma's wedding wearing a silver necklace?" There was a long silence. Then Linda said, "Why are you asking about her?" Margaret sat down. "Because I found a letter from Emma." Linda became quiet. "What letter?" Margaret explained everything. When she finished, Linda took a deep breath. "Margaret, there is something I should have told you years ago." Margaret's heart sank. "What?" "That woman came to me before the wedding." "Who is she?" "Her name was Valerie." Margaret frowned. "Valerie who?" "I don't know her last name." "What did she want?" Linda hesitated. "She asked me questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know about your first marriage." Margaret froze. Her first marriage. She had been married before Emma was born. It had ended when Margaret was very young, and she rarely talked about it. Emma knew very little about that period of her mother's life. Margaret had always believed there was no reason to bring those memories back. Why would she ask about that? "I don't know," Linda said. But she seemed convinced that something had happened. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing important." Margaret didn't believe her. "Linda, tell me the truth." Another silence. Finally, Linda said, "She told me she had proof that your first husband wasn't the man everyone believed he was." Margaret felt a cold sensation run through her body. "My first husband died years ago." "I know." "Then what kind of proof could she have?" "I don't know." Margaret stood up. "Did Emma know about this woman?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because I saw them talking together at the engagement party." Margaret closed her eyes. Suddenly, the timeline began to make sense. Valerie had appeared before the wedding. Emma had spoken to her. 3 days after the wedding, Emma wrote the letter. Then she stopped speaking to her mother. Margaret had spent 12 years blaming herself for something she didn't understand. Now she knew someone had deliberately put something into Emma's mind. But she still didn't know what. That evening, Margaret searched through an old box containing documents from her first marriage. Most of the papers were ordinary. There were old bills, photographs, insurance documents, and a few letters. Then she found a small envelope that she had never opened. It had been hidden inside an old book. The envelope contained a newspaper clipping. Margaret read it once. Then again. Her first husband's name was printed in the article. But the story wasn't about his death. It was about a business dispute that had happened several years before Margaret met him. At the bottom of the article was another name. Valerie's name. Margaret suddenly understood why the woman had come looking for her. But before she could read the rest of the article, her phone rang. The number was unknown. Margaret answered. Nobody spoke. Then a woman's voice said, "You found the letter." Margaret's heart stopped. "Who is this?" The woman ignored the question. "Don't try to contact Emma." "Where is my daughter?" "She's safer without you." Margaret gripped the phone. "You've already taken 12 years from me. I'm not letting you take another day." The woman became silent. Then she said something that Margaret would never forget. "Your daughter doesn't hate you, Margaret. She is afraid of you." The call ended. Margaret stood completely still. For 12 years, she had believed her daughter had abandoned her. Now she finally understood that Emma might have been living with a completely different version of the truth. And somewhere out there was a woman who knew exactly why. Margaret spent the entire night thinking about the phone call. The woman's final words kept repeating in her mind. "Your daughter doesn't hate you. She is afraid of you." By morning, Margaret had made a decision. She was going to find Emma herself. She searched through every old document she had from the years before Emma was born. She wanted to understand what Valerie had discovered about her first marriage. After several hours, she found an old folder containing documents from a small business her first husband, Richard, had owned. Most of the papers were ordinary, but one document immediately caught her attention. It was a transfer agreement dated 6 months before Richard died. The agreement showed that Richard had transferred ownership of the business to someone named Valerie Grant. Margaret stared at the name. Valerie. She suddenly remembered something from 25 years earlier. Richard had once mentioned a woman named Valerie who worked with him, but Margaret had never met her. Why would Valerie still be interested in her family after all these years? Margaret continued searching. At the bottom of the folder, she found an old photograph of Richard standing outside the business office. Valerie was standing beside him. But there was another person in the photograph. Emma's husband, Daniel. Margaret felt confused. Daniel had been connected to this story long before he married Emma. She immediately called Linda again. Did Daniel know Valerie before he met Emma? Linda didn't answer immediately. Then she said, I think so. What do you mean? Daniel worked for Richard's company for a short time. Margaret sat down. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because Richard asked everyone to keep it private. Margaret looked at the photograph. What was Daniel doing there? I don't know. Margaret knew she wasn't going to get answers from Linda. She needed to find Daniel. Fortunately, she still had an old business card from his office. She called the number. A woman answered. Daniel's office. Margaret explained who she was. There was a pause. Mrs. Collins, Daniel hasn't worked here for years. I know. I need to ask about something from his past. What kind of thing? Valerie Grant. The woman became silent. Then she said, you should speak to Mr. Harris. Who is Mr. Harris? He was Daniel's supervisor. Margaret wrote down the number. When she called him, an elderly man answered. After hearing Valerie's name, his tone immediately changed. Where did you hear that name? My daughter disappeared from my life 12 years ago because someone told her something about me. Mr. Harris sighed. I was afraid this would happen one day. What happened? Valerie believed your first husband had stolen money from her family. Margaret frowned. Richard? Yes. But Richard died. I know. Then why blame me? Because she believed you knew more than you admitted. Margaret felt angry. I didn't know anything. I believe you. Then why did my daughter believe otherwise? Mr. Harris hesitated. Because Valerie showed her documents. What documents? Financial records. Margaret suddenly remembered the letter Emma had written after her wedding. She had been shown proof. Not just told a story. Someone had shown her documents that looked convincing enough to make her distrust her own mother. Margaret asked, Can you tell me where Emma is now? I don't know. You worked with her husband. I did. Then please help me. Mr. Harris sighed. Daniel asked me never to interfere. Why? Because he was trying to protect Emma. Margaret froze. From Valerie? No. Then from whom? Mr. Harris didn't answer. Margaret could hear his breathing through the phone. Finally he said, You need to understand something. Valerie wasn't the person who convinced Emma to leave you. Margaret's heart began racing. Then who was? I don't know. You do know. No, Mrs. Collins. I know who delivered the documents to Emma. That's all. Who? Mr. Harris finally gave her a name. Your daughter's husband. Margaret felt numb. Daniel had been the person who showed Emma the documents. Her own son-in-law. The man she had trusted. The man who had taken her daughter away from her. Margaret immediately searched for his old address. It took her several hours, but she eventually found it. She drove there that afternoon. The house was empty. But a neighbor told her that Daniel had moved away several years earlier. Do you know where he went? The neighbor shook her head. Actually, a woman came looking for him last week. Who? I don't know her name. Did she look familiar? The neighbor thought for a moment. She wore a silver necklace. Margaret's heart sank. Valerie. The neighbor continued. She left something in the mailbox. Margaret looked inside. There was a small envelope. Her name was written on it. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph of Emma and her young son. On the back was a handwritten message. She finally knows what really happened. Margaret looked at the photograph again. Then her phone rang. It was Emma. For 12 years, Margaret had dreamed of seeing her daughter's name appear on her screen. She answered immediately. Neither of them spoke. Then Emma whispered, Mom? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Emma. Her daughter began crying. I need to tell you something. What? I was wrong about you. Margaret closed her eyes. Where are you? Emma hesitated. I can't tell you yet. Why? Because the person who lied to me 12 years ago knows that I've discovered the truth. Margaret's heart began pounding. Who? Emma whispered. I think you're in danger too. The call suddenly ended. Margaret stood alone in the driveway, still holding the phone. After 12 years, her daughter had finally called. But instead of bringing peace, the call had opened an even bigger question. What had Emma discovered? And why was the same person who separated them still trying to keep them apart? Margaret couldn't move after the call ended. For 12 years, she had imagined what it would feel like to hear her daughter's voice again. She had expected anger, sadness, or perhaps silence. She had never expected Emma to tell her that she was wrong about her. Margaret immediately called the number back. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. She sat in her car for several minutes, staring at the photograph of Emma and her grandson. She had never met the boy. She didn't even know his birthday. Yet there he was, smiling beside the daughter she had spent 12 years missing. Margaret decided to return home and examine everything she had found. The first thing she noticed was the photograph of Emma's wedding. The woman wearing the silver necklace was still standing in the background. Margaret placed the photograph beside the newspaper clipping about Richard's business. There was something familiar about Valerie's face, but she couldn't understand why. Then she remembered an old conversation with Richard. Years before Emma was born, Richard had once told Margaret that his business partner had a sister who lived in another city. Her name had been Valerie, but Richard had always said they were no longer in contact. Margaret suddenly wondered if that had been true. She searched online for Valerie Grant. There were several results, but one caught her attention. A company had been registered under that name nearly 20 years ago. The address was only 40 minutes from Margaret's home. She drove there the next morning. The building was small and almost empty. A receptionist told her Valerie no longer worked there. Do you know where she went? The receptionist hesitated. She comes by occasionally. Can you contact her? The woman shook her head. She told us never to give out her information. Margaret was about to leave when she noticed something hanging on the wall. A photograph from the company's opening day. Valerie was standing in the middle. Beside her was Daniel. Margaret stared at the picture. Her daughter's husband had been connected to Valerie long before the wedding. But why? She took a picture of the photograph with her phone. Then someone behind her said, "You shouldn't be looking at that." Margaret turned. An older man stood near the doorway. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Reed. I worked with Valerie." Margaret immediately asked, "Do you know Emma?" Thomas looked surprised. "Yes. Where is she?" "I don't know. Please. She's my daughter." Thomas looked at Margaret carefully. Then he lowered his voice. Emma discovered something about her father. "Richard?" "No. Her father was Daniel." Margaret frowned. "Daniel is her husband." Thomas shook his head. "I'm talking about your first husband." Margaret felt confused. "Richard was Emma's father." "I know. Then what are you saying?" Thomas looked toward the empty office. "Richard wasn't Emma's biological father." Margaret couldn't breathe. "What?" Thomas continued. "Richard raised her. But he wasn't her biological father." Margaret stepped backward. "That's impossible." That's what Valerie believed too. Margaret's mind raced. Emma had never known this. Or had she? Thomas said, "Daniel discovered the truth years ago." Margaret stared at him. "How?" "Through an old medical record." "Why didn't he tell Emma?" "Because he was afraid the truth would destroy her." Margaret remembered Emma's letter. "They told me you had been hiding something from our family." Suddenly, everything seemed connected. Emma had been shown documents suggesting that Margaret had hidden the identity of her real father. But Margaret had never known. She had always believed Richard was Emma's biological father. Thomas continued. "Valerie found out that Richard wasn't Emma's father. She believed you had deliberately hidden the truth." "I didn't." "I know. Then why did she tell Emma?" "Because she believed Emma deserved to know." Margaret shook her head. "That's not enough to destroy a family." Thomas looked at her sadly. Valerie wasn't the only person who believed that. Margaret immediately thought of Daniel, her son-in-law, the man who had shown Emma the documents. Daniel knew. Yes. Then why did he help Valerie? Thomas hesitated. He didn't. Margaret stared at him. What? Daniel tried to stop her. Thomas explained that Daniel had discovered Valerie was planning to reveal the information shortly before the wedding. He tried to convince her to wait until after the wedding so Emma wouldn't be overwhelmed. But Valerie refused. Then Daniel made a terrible mistake. He showed Emma the documents himself. He thought that if Emma heard the truth from him, she would understand. Instead, Emma believed Daniel was protecting Margaret. She thought everyone had been lying to her. That was why she left. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. So Daniel caused the misunderstanding. Thomas nodded. But he spent years trying to fix it. Then why didn't he come to me? Because Emma asked him not to. Margaret looked shocked. She didn't want me to know. She was confused and angry. She believed you had deliberately hidden the truth. Margaret looked down. 12 years. 12 years of silence caused by a secret she didn't even know existed. Then Thomas said something that changed everything. Emma recently found Richard's original medical records. Margaret looked up. What did they show? Thomas took a deep breath. They proved that Richard wasn't her biological father. Margaret felt tears roll down her face. Then who was? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he gave her an old envelope. This is why Emma called you. Margaret opened it. Inside was a single photograph of a young man. On the back was a name. Andrew Collins. Margaret stared at it. She knew that name. Andrew had been her closest friend before she met Richard, and he had disappeared from her life shortly before her marriage. Margaret's hands began trembling. She had always believed Andrew had simply moved away, but now she was beginning to wonder whether the biggest secret of her life had been hidden from her too. Margaret couldn't stop looking at the photograph of Andrew Collins. She had not seen his face in more than 30 years, but she remembered him immediately. Andrew had been kind, patient, and completely different from Richard. Before her marriage, Margaret and Andrew had been very close. They had talked about building a life together, but one day Andrew simply disappeared from her life. A few months later, Margaret met Richard. She had always believed Andrew had moved away and started a new life somewhere else. Now she wasn't so sure. Thomas watched her carefully. You know him? Margaret nodded. He was part of my life before Richard. Then you should know something. Margaret looked at him. Andrew never left because he wanted to. Her heart began beating faster. What happened? Thomas explained that Andrew had been working with Richard at the time. He had discovered irregularities in the company's financial records and wanted to report them. Richard had convinced him to stay quiet, but Andrew refused. A few weeks later, Andrew disappeared. Margaret stared at Thomas. Are you saying Richard had something to do with it? No. I'm saying someone wanted Andrew gone. Who? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he asked, do you remember the week Andrew disappeared? Margaret closed her eyes. She remembered it clearly. Andrew had come to her house one evening looking frightened. He had told her that someone had been following him. She had asked what was wrong. He had simply said, if something happens to me, don't trust anyone who tells you I left willingly. The next morning, he was gone. Margaret had waited for him to return. He never did. Until now. Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out an old document. This was found among Andrew's belongings. Margaret opened it. It was a letter addressed to her. The date was from 3 days before Andrew disappeared. She began reading. Margaret, I wanted to tell you everything, but I don't know if I will get the chance. Richard knows about the records. He also knows about us. If I disappear, please don't believe that I abandoned you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had spent decades believing Andrew had chosen to leave. He hadn't. Someone had made him disappear. Then she noticed something else. The letter mentioned a child. Margaret stopped reading. The next line said, there's another reason I need to protect you. If the child is born, they may use her against you. Margaret's hands started shaking. She looked at Thomas. What child? Thomas remained silent. Margaret read the final part of the letter. If you are reading this after I am gone, then you need to know that Emma is my daughter. Margaret couldn't breathe. The room seemed to disappear around her. Emma wasn't Richard's daughter. She was Andrew's. The truth Margaret had never known had finally come back to her. But there was something she couldn't understand. If Andrew was Emma's biological father, why had nobody told her? Thomas explained that Richard had discovered the truth before Emma was born. He had threatened Andrew and forced him to stay away. Andrew eventually tried to expose everything. That's when he disappeared. Margaret wiped her tears. Where is he now? Thomas looked at her. I don't know. You just told me he didn't leave willingly. He didn't. Then where is he? Thomas hesitated. There's a possibility he's still alive. Margaret stared at him. After all these years, the man she had mourned in silence might still be somewhere in the world. Before she could ask another question, her phone rang. It was Emma. Margaret answered immediately. Emma? Her daughter was crying. Mom, I know everything now. Margaret couldn't speak. Emma continued. I know Richard wasn't my father. Margaret closed her eyes. Emma, I never knew. I know. Those 2 words broke Margaret's heart. You believe me? Yes. There was silence between them. Then Emma said, but there's something else. What? I found records about my biological father. Margaret looked at Thomas. Andrew. Emma's voice became quiet. Yes. Margaret felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Do you know where he is? I think so. Margaret stood up. Where? Emma took a breath. Mom, he's been living under another name for years. Margaret's heart raced. What name? Emma whispered. David Miller. The call ended. Margaret immediately searched the name. There were hundreds of results. But one photograph stopped her. An older man standing outside a small bookstore. The face was older. The hair was gray. But Margaret knew those eyes. It was Andrew. After more than 30 years, The man she thought had disappeared forever was alive. And Emma knew where to find him. Margaret barely slept that night. The photograph of Andrew, now living under the name David Miller, was still open on her phone. For decades, she had believed he had abandoned her without an explanation. Now she knew he had been forced out of her life. The next morning, Emma sent Margaret an address. It was a small bookstore in a quiet town several hours away. Margaret wanted to go alone, but Emma insisted on meeting her there. When Margaret arrived, Emma was already waiting outside. For a moment, neither of them moved. 12 years of silence stood between them. Then Emma walked toward her. "Mom." Margaret hugged her without saying anything. They both cried. There were no accusations. No explanations. Just two people who had spent too many years missing each other. After a few minutes, Emma pulled away. "I'm sorry." Margaret shook her head. "You believed what you were shown. I should have asked you. I should have told you more about my past." Emma looked down. "I thought you had lied to me my entire life." "I know. And I thought Daniel was protecting me." Margaret sighed. "Daniel made mistakes too." Emma nodded. "I know that now." They entered the bookstore together. An elderly man was standing behind the counter. Margaret stopped. She knew him immediately. Andrew looked at her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he whispered, "Margaret." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're alive." Andrew nodded. "I never stopped thinking about you." Margaret walked toward him. "Why didn't you come back?" Andrew looked down. "Because I was afraid. Of Richard. Of what would happen to you and Emma if I returned." He explained that after discovering the financial records, he had been threatened. He was told that if he tried to expose the truth, Margaret and the unborn Emma would be dragged into the situation. Andrew disappeared because he believed staying away was the only way to keep them safe. But he never stopped watching from a distance. He knew when Emma was born. He knew when she graduated. He even attended her wedding from across the street. Margaret's eyes widened. "You were at Emma's wedding?" Andrew nodded. "I couldn't stay away." Margaret suddenly remembered the woman in the silver necklace. "Was Valerie there?" Andrew's expression changed. "Yes." "Why?" "Because she knew about me." Emma looked at Andrew. "Then why did she tell me Mom was hiding everything?" Andrew sighed. "Because Valerie believed your mother had known the truth all along." "She didn't," Emma said. "I know." Andrew looked at Margaret. "I tried to tell Valerie, but she wouldn't listen." Then Andrew revealed something Margaret had never expected. Daniel had discovered the truth years earlier. He had learned that Andrew was Emma's biological father and that Richard had hidden it. Daniel tried to uncover the old records, but Valerie got to them first. She showed Emma selected documents after the wedding, making it appear as though Margaret had deliberately hidden Andrew's identity. Emma believed her. Daniel realized his mistake and spent years trying to correct it. But every time he tried to contact Margaret, someone interfered. Margaret asked who. Andrew looked at Emma. "Daniel's own brother." Emma froze. "Michael?" Andrew nodded. Michael had been involved with the old financial records. He knew that if the truth about Richard and Andrew became public, several people could be implicated. He wanted the documents destroyed. That was why he had encouraged Emma to stay away from Margaret. Margaret suddenly understood the phone call she had received years ago. The person who had told Emma not to trust her mother hadn't been Valerie alone. There had been others helping her. Emma looked at Andrew. "Why didn't you tell me who my real father was?" Andrew's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid you would hate me for disappearing." Emma walked toward him. "I don't hate you." Andrew began crying. For the first time in decades, he finally stood face to face with his daughter. Margaret watched them quietly. Then she noticed something on the bookstore counter. An old envelope. Her name was written on it. She picked it up. Andrew looked surprised. "I didn't put that there." Margaret opened it. Inside was a single photograph of Richard. On the back was a message. Richard wasn't the person who started this. Margaret looked at Andrew. Then who was? Andrew's expression became serious. "I don't know." He pointed to the photograph. "But I think Richard was protecting someone." Margaret turned the photograph over again. There was another line beneath the message. "Ask what happened the night Andrew disappeared." Margaret's heart sank. The truth about her past was finally coming together. But one question remained. What had actually happened on the night Andrew disappeared? And why had someone spent more than 30 years making sure nobody found the answer? Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the message on the photograph. Ask what happened the night Andrew disappeared. For more than 30 years, she had believed Andrew simply vanished. Now she realized that night might hold the answer to everything. The next morning, Andrew unlocked a small storage room behind the bookstore. Inside were boxes filled with old papers, photographs, and notebooks. I kept these all these years, he said. Why? Because one day I knew someone would ask questions. Margaret and Emma spent hours going through the documents. Most of them were old business records. Then Emma found a notebook. Dad, what's this? Andrew immediately looked uncomfortable. I haven't opened that in years. Margaret placed it on the table. The notebook contained Andrew's personal journal. The final entries were written during the week before he disappeared. Margaret began reading. The first few pages described meetings with Richard and arguments about missing money. Then she reached the final entry. The date matched the night Andrew vanished. Richard called me and asked me to meet him at the warehouse. He said he finally had proof of who was behind everything. Margaret continued reading. When I arrived, Richard wasn't alone. Someone else was there. The next page had been torn out. Margaret stared at the missing page. Who removed this? Andrew shook his head. I didn't. Emma flipped through the notebook. A folded piece of paper suddenly fell out. It was an old map. A red circle had been drawn around an abandoned warehouse near the river. Margaret looked at Andrew. Is this where you met Richard? Andrew nodded. I haven't been there since that night. Emma stood up. Then let's go. By sunset, the three of them arrived at the warehouse. The building looked abandoned. Broken windows covered the walls. Weeds pushed through the cracked concrete. Andrew stood silently. I never thought I'd come back here. They entered through a side door. Dust covered everything. Most of the building was empty. Then Margaret noticed a small office at the far end. Inside, an old filing cabinet remained locked. Andrew stared at it. I remember this. Emma found a rusted key hanging on the wall. To everyone's surprise, it still worked. The cabinet opened. Inside were dozens of files. Most were damaged by age. But one folder was labeled confidential. Margaret opened it. The documents inside revealed years of hidden financial transactions. Names appeared again and again. Richard, Valerie, Michael, and several others. Then Emma found something else. A cassette tape. Andrew looked shocked. I haven't seen one of those in decades. Fortunately, there was an old recorder in the office. Andrew pressed play. The recording crackled. Then a voice filled the room. Richard's voice. It's working. A second voice answered. Margaret froze. She recognized it immediately. Valerie. The recording continued. Richard sounded nervous. We don't have much time. Valerie replied, then tell me who it is. Several seconds passed. Then Richard said, I finally know who's behind the missing accounts. Margaret's heart pounded. Valerie asked who. The recording suddenly became distorted. Static filled the room. Then another voice appeared. A man's voice. One Margaret had never heard before. Turn that off. The tape abruptly ended. Nobody spoke. Emma looked at Andrew. Who is that? Andrew slowly sat down. His face had gone pale. I know that voice. Margaret looked at him. Who is it? Andrew hesitated. Then he whispered. I thought he was dead. The room fell silent. What do you mean? Andrew stared at the recorder. That's Richard's older brother. Margaret frowned. Richard told me he didn't have any siblings. He lied. Emma looked confused. Why? Andrew took a deep breath. Because his brother disappeared long before any of us met him. Margaret felt a chill. What's his name? Andrew looked at her. Edward Grant. Emma's eyes widened. Grant? Andrew nodded. The same last name Valerie uses. Suddenly everything started making sense. Valerie hadn't spent years investigating the mystery by accident. She was connected to it from the beginning. Then Margaret noticed another document hidden beneath the tape recorder. It was a recent bank statement. Only 3 months old. Someone had been paying property taxes on the warehouse. Someone who was supposedly dead. The payment was signed with one name. Edward Grant. Margaret stared at the paper. After 30 years, the man everyone believed was gone might still be alive. And if he was alive, he might be the only person who knew what really happened the night Andrew disappeared. Margaret, Emma, and Andrew left the warehouse with the old documents and cassette tape. They now knew that Edward Grant, the man everyone believed was dead, had been paying the warehouse taxes only 3 months earlier. Andrew couldn't understand it. I saw Edward disappear, he said. I was there the night he left. Margaret looked at him. Then maybe he never left the way you thought he did. They returned to Andrew's bookstore and began searching through the old records again. Emma noticed something written on the back of the bank statement. It was an address. They drove there the following morning. The address belonged to a small house on the edge of town. An elderly man opened the door. Andrew stopped breathing. "Edward." The man looked at him for several seconds. Then he quietly said, "I wondered when you would come back." Andrew stepped inside. "You're alive." Edward nodded. "I had to disappear." Margaret immediately asked why. Edward looked at her. "Because Richard wasn't the person you thought he was." Margaret felt confused. "What does that mean?" Edward explained that Richard had discovered the financial scheme but wasn't the person who started it. The real operation had been created by people inside the company, and Richard had initially tried to expose them. But when he realized how powerful they were, he became frightened. He began hiding records and pretending to cooperate. Andrew had discovered part of the truth and wanted to expose everything. That's why Richard called Andrew to the warehouse that night. "He was trying to help you," Edward said. Andrew looked stunned. "Then why did I disappear?" "Because Valerie arrived before you could leave." Edward explained that Valerie had been trying to recover the missing records. She believed Andrew had taken them. She threatened him. Andrew escaped through the back of the warehouse, but someone else was waiting outside. Edward had helped him disappear because he believed it was the only way to keep Margaret and the unborn Emma safe. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "So Richard wasn't trying to hurt me?" "No," Edward said. "He made terrible decisions, but he was trying to protect you." Margaret looked at Andrew. "And what about Emma?" Edward sighed. That's where Daniel made his mistake. Daniel had discovered the truth years later. He found Andrew and learned that Emma was his biological daughter. He wanted to tell Emma everything. But Valerie had already started investigating the old records. Daniel believed that if he revealed everything at once, Emma would become a target. Instead, he showed her only part of the evidence. Emma misunderstood. She believed Margaret had deliberately hidden Andrew's identity. Daniel realized what he had done, but by then Emma had already walked away from her mother. For 12 years, everyone had been trying to protect Emma in their own way. And every attempt had pushed her farther from Margaret. Emma began crying. "I spent 12 years thinking Mom didn't love me." Margaret reached for her hand. "I never stopped loving you." Emma held her mother tightly. For the first time in 12 years, they cried together without secrets between them. Later that evening, Andrew gave Margaret one final envelope. "This was meant for you." Margaret opened it. It was a letter Richard had written shortly before his death. "Margaret, I know there are things I should have told you. I know you may hate me when you discover the truth. But please believe one thing. Emma was never a secret because I didn't love her. She was a secret because I was afraid someone would use her to hurt you. I made choices that caused pain. I can't change them. But if there is one thing I wish I could change, it is the years you and Emma lost because of my silence. Please forgive me if you can. And please tell Emma that her father loved her, even when he was too afraid to say it." Margaret folded the letter slowly. She didn't know whether she could forgive Richard completely. Maybe some wounds never disappear. But she finally understood that the story she had believed for 12 years wasn't the real story. The next few months were difficult. There were investigations into the old financial records, questions about Valerie and Michael, and years of complicated history to untangle. But something much more important happened. Margaret became part of Emma's life again. She met her grandson. She celebrated his birthday. She listened to Emma talk about her marriage, her work, and all the ordinary things she had missed. Andrew slowly became part of their lives too. He never tried to replace the years they had lost. He simply appreciated every moment he was given. One afternoon, Margaret found the old wedding photograph again. The woman with the silver necklace was still standing in the background. But this time Margaret didn't feel afraid when she looked at it. She understood what that photograph represented. A secret that had taken 12 years to uncover. A family separated by silence. And a truth that had finally brought them back together. Margaret placed the photograph in a new album. Underneath it, she wrote one sentence. "Sometimes the truth arrives late, but it can still give us a chance to make things right." For 12 years, Margaret had believed she had lost her daughter. Now she knew the truth. She hadn't lost Emma. They had simply lost 12 years to a secret neither of them understood. And from that day forward, Margaret decided they would never waste another one. Would you forgive someone who kept a life-changing secret from you for years if you later discovered they were trying to protect you?